Alright, welcome. This is going to be an English 10A1 comprehensive exam review. This is Mr. Frank doing this. So some of you who have me for class, this will look very familiar. Others of you who are tuning in, welcome. Thanks for checking this out. I hope it's helpful. We're going to go through everything that's of use here. I'll start by looking at the review sheet that was distributed via eBackpack. Talk about grammar. Try to anticipate questions that might happen with that. And then go on to talking about lit, trying to hit upon major points, and then end with some thoughts on written section and essays. Of course, this can't be completely exhaustive, but I'll try to get as many of the big ideas into focus as I can. I will try to be as clear in my explanations as possible. I will try to make this watchable. In other words, not too long, but at the same time I want to have enough information in there. So feel free to watch this multiple times if that is helpful to you, because I think that a lot of this stuff will be seen on the exam, and hopefully we can help you out by bringing up some of the major concepts that we've seen throughout the course of the year. So let's get into it. Let's start with the review sheet. So here we have the English 10A1 review sheet. You can see that we've narrowed down the spelling. These are listed alphabetically for you. We've narrowed down the vocab, also listed alphabetically for you. Onto the next page. And now we get into some actual grammar. Now I have the answers here. So if you've not done this yet, maybe you want to stop and go to the review sheet and do these. But the answers are here. This is also posted to my website, mrfranksclass.com. Follow the links for English 10A1, and you should see a link to some documents that are shared. You can pull this up. So if you want an answer key to check yourself, what I'll be doing here is going through these with explanations, and hopefully, like I said, anticipating questions you might have, offering some explanations as to how to do the operations and the come out with the understandings we want you to have. So we'll go through this one section at a time. Let's zoom in here and talk about parts of speech first. Good. All right. We're giving you a sentence. We're underlining a word. We're asking you to determine that part of speech. I heard you shouting across the room. Across is a preposition. Prepositions, remember, show the relationship between a noun and some other word in the sentence. The noun is the object of the preposition, so in this case, room. And prepositions usually show location, usually like a physical position, or sometimes they show a time relationship. So a lot of times prepositions are place words like across, above, beneath, next to, alongside. Other times they will indicate a temporal sense like before, during, after, since. So that's a good way of knowing prepositions. Always have to have an object. I suddenly felt very cold. Suddenly is an adverb. A lot of adverbs end in ly, not every single one, but adverbs modify verbs, adjectives, or other adverbs. They answer questions like how, when, where, to what extent, or under what condition. Wow, I don't know what to say. Wow is an interjection, a word that expresses some kind of emotion and has no grammatical relationship to anything else going on in the sentence. Usually set off by some kind of punctuation. He carefully measured the plank of wood before cutting. Measured is a verb, is an action verb in this case, expresses the activity of the sentence. His favorite cereal was on sale at the store. Cereal is a noun, a person, place, thing, or idea. Could anyone tell me how to get to the bus stop? Anyone is a pronoun. This would be something we call an indefinite pronoun. It refers to someone or something not specifically named. There are a whole bunch of different types of pronouns. There are personal pronouns, there are interrogative pronouns, there are indefinite pronouns, there are demonstrative pronouns, but they all stand in place of a noun. He needs lots of help, so I offered to assist him. So can function a couple of different ways. When it's used here, as it is, it's a conjunction. So is used with the comma to join together independent clauses. So is a conjunction. So can also be used frequently as an adverb, as in, I was so late. How late was I? I was so late. It's modifying another adverb. modifying another modifier. So in this case, though, it's a conjunction. Whoever was on the phone refused to say his name. Was is a verb, is a linking verb, stated being verb. The large sweater costs more money than the medium one. Large describes sweater, so we call that an adjective. Or describing a noun or pronoun. Answers the questions which one or what kind. Or you could say how much or how many. And his emotions cannot be controlled. Emotions is a noun, is an abstract noun. Abstract nouns cannot be perceived by the five senses. They encapsulate ideas. So emotions, something you can't see, but a noun nonetheless. Let's move this up. And we're talking now about, let me zoom a little. There we go. We're talking about parts of the sentence. Here we're talking about subjects, verbs, but in this particular case, direct and indirect objects, predicate nominatives, and predicate adjectives. We're, of course, dealing with what type of verb we have, and then figuring out from there what type of complement we have. She seems comfortable in that new chair. Comfortable here is a predicate adjective. The verb seems is important. Seems is a linking verb. And it's describing the subject she, so predicate adjective. James watched 2 hours of television last night. Watched what? So watched is an action verb. When you ask watched what, you get the direct object. Okay. Remember that direct objects and indirect objects will never be in prep phrases, so television can't be your object. It's hours. That's the direct object. His mother gave me a baseball bat for my birthday. Gave what? Gave a baseball bat. That's my direct object. Gave it to me. So that's an indirect object. Indirect objects are to whom or for whom an action is done. And in English, because our syntax in English relies so much on position, you'll always have an indirect object between the verb and direct object. People appear taller in those shoes. Just like number 11, this is a predicate adjective. Appear is a linking verb. And we're describing people as taller. You must take action immediately. Must take is your verb phrase. Must take what? Must take action. Direct object receives the action of the verb. The United Nations is a world peacekeeping force. Predicate nominative. Now, again, we have a linking verb is. Instead of describing the United Nations with an adjective, we are renaming the United Nations with a noun. So predicate nominative force is a predicate nominative is a noun, renaming the subject of the sentence after a linking verb. This chicken soup tastes homemade. Predicate adjective. Taste is a linking verb. We're describing the chicken soup as homemade. Now on to the next page. Unfortunately, we have the answer choices here, but my talk through will describe what types of phrases we're dealing with, so that shouldn't be too much of a problem. Let's go on to the next page. All right, so let's zoom in a little here and let's deal with the phrases first. Here we are. That'll do. Skiing down the mountain can be difficult. Skiing down the mountain is a gerund phrase. All right, ing form of a verb, ski, skiing. When you have the ing form of a verb, you could have two types of phrases. You could have a gerund, you could have a participle. How can we tell the difference? Well, gerunds act as nouns. Participles act as adjectives. In this case, skiing down the mountain is a noun. It's the subject of the sentence. There's a couple of ways of creating kind of a shortcut for yourself on this. One is that people will say that a participial phrase can be taken out of the sentence, a gerund phrase cannot. And that's true here. If I take this out of the sentence, I just have can be difficult, and that's a fragment. The other way is that people will say that gerund phrases can be replaced by it. It can be difficult. That works too. So this is a gerund phrase because it's a subject, it's a noun. To go to Italy on your honeymoon is a great experience. As soon as you see to plus a verb, to go, you know it's an infinitive phrase. Very simple. Infinitives can act as adjectives, adverbs, or nouns, but we're not going to ask you that level of sophistication on the test, so just know that this is an infinitive, and you're good to go. The player substituted at the end of the half was hurt. All right, substituted is an ed form of a verb, and here substituted describes the player. That makes it a participial phrase. I love going to New York City. I love what? I love going to New York City. It's a direct object. It's a gerund phrase. Again, I love it. I love it. It is the direct object. It takes the place of this gerund phrase, but going to New York City is definitely a noun. Joe Torre, former baseball manager, will be signing autographs next week. This isn't a positive. Positives and appositive phrases are nouns or based around nouns that sit next to some other noun and tell you more about it. So former baseball manager gives you more information about Joe Torre. And frequently appositive phrases are set off by commas just because they are, I guess what you could consider non-restrictive information in the sentence. Softball players often practice in the off-season. This is a prepositional phrase. In is a preposition, right? In this case, if I asked you further, we'd say it's an adverb phrase. It tells you when they practice. Right? We're describing the verb practice. At her graduation, her parents stood proud. Again, also prepositional, right? Tells you where they stood. They stood at her graduation. So again, an adverb phrase. The beam supporting the house needed to be replaced. Supporting the house describes beam, participial phrase. We could remove that. We could say the beam needed to be replaced. That sentence is fine. So supporting the house describes beam, participial phrase, not necessary. She had always wanted to play the violin. Again, we have 2 plus a verb form, just as we had 19. This is an infinitive phrase. I wanted to help by fixing the broken clock. Now, interestingly, ing form of the verb here. When you have an ing form of a verb follow a preposition, it's frequently a gerund phrase because it's acting as the object of that prep. I wanted to help by, right? What am I doing? By what? By fixing the broken clock. So fixing the broken clock is a noun acting as the object of the preposition by. You have a gerund phrase here. Let's move on to talking about agreement. Okay? Agreement will be in 2 parts, subject, verb, and pronoun antecedent, and they're both found here. Topics are the same, though. Whether it's pronoun antecedent or subject, verb, you're going to have indefinite pronouns, compounds, collectives, special cases, so be on alert for those things. More of the chicken is in the refrigerator. Now, there are 6 indefinite pronouns that can be singular or plural. All, any, more, most, none, or some. So we have more here, and that's one of those. How do I know more is singular? Well, it refers to chicken, and chicken is singular. So more of the chicken is in the refrigerator. If I said more of the chickens, I would say more of the chickens are in the refrigerator. So when you have all, any, more, most, none, or some, you look at the object of the prep phrase following. Both James and John are coming to the party tomorrow. When you join things with and, it usually becomes plural. Either my textbook or my notes are incorrect about this date in history. And I notice I circled or there. When you join things with or nor, they usually keep the number that they are. So 2 singulars are singular, 2 plurals are plural. What if you mix? So here we have textbook, which is singular, and notes, which is plural. The rule is this. Whichever is closer to the verb is what you use. So notes is closer to the verb, notes is plural, so I say are. If I flipped the sentence around and I said either my notes or my textbook, then I'm going to say either my notes or my textbook is incorrect about this date in history. The test and the essay have been moved to next week. Again, test and essay are singular, but when they're joined by and, they become plural. 2/3 of my friends have gone to that school. 2/3 could be singular or plural. It refers to friends, which is a plural quantity, so we say have. Has someone seen my raincoat? When you have questions, they're usually in inverted order, so we have to look and see what the subject here is. Someone. Someone is singular. Any pronoun that has one in it. Someone, anyone, no one. So we say has seen my raincoat. Each of the students brought his or her copy of the book to class. The important word here is not students. The important word here is each. Each is singular, no matter how you do it. So each brought his or her. Some of his things were lost, and he could never find them. Some of his things were lost, and he could never find them. The antecedent here is some. And again, some could be singular or plural. It refers to things. Things is plural, so we say them. Either Stephanie or James needed his or her coat for the movie. Stephanie and James are both singular. They're joined by or, so they say singular. Since we have both possibilities, we need to say his or her. Only a few of the schools listed offer nursing classes as part of their programs. Few is your antecedent here, and few is always plural. There are actually only 4 indefinite pronouns that are always plural. Both, few, many, and several. And that makes sense. If you think about those words, both, few, many, and several, they always refer to a plural quantity. All right, modifiers. Modifiers embraces a couple of things here. It's going to talk about things like good and well, slow and slowly, real and really, bad and badly. We can add to that list as well. It's going to talk about misplaced and dangling modifiers. It could talk about positive, comparative, and superlative forms. So let's cross those bridges when we come to them in the following questions. Anna loves movies more than Mark. This is fine, right? More than, right, we're making a comparison, but it's lined up right, so it's okay. Who is tallest, you or John? This is a problem, right? This is where we talk about positive, comparative, and superlative form. So tall is what we call the positive form. It's just a regular adjective. Comparative is the form where you're comparing one thing to one other thing. So here I'm comparing you to John. I would say taller. If I'm comparing 3 or more people, then there's going to be someone who is the tallest of all 3 or of all 4 or all 100, whatever it might be. So in this case, we want to say who is taller, you or John. Her dog was calmer than mine. Again, good use of the comparative form. Carrie did well on her test. This is correct. Well is an adverb. How did she do? We're talking about an action here. We're talking about describing the verb do. She did well. She dribbled the ball real fast. This is incorrect. We're describing fast. Fast is an adjective. How fast? Really fast. So we didn't know why that would be really. You should back up slow if you cannot see behind you. You would say you should back up slowly, because again, adverb. What are you doing? You're backing up. You're performing an action. You do that action slowly. Her idea was real excellent. Her idea was really excellent. Again, we need the adverb form to describe excellent. Our trip got off to a bad start. That is correct. Start is a noun. We described the start as being bad. We use the adjective form. Badly would again describe an action. So those can be the type of thing that a lot of people will trust their ear, but you need to make sure your ear is well trained. So make sure that you are following the rule, not just what you think sounds correct. And then finally in the grammar section we have some punctuation. This section deals with commas. Where does the comma go in the sentence? Let's go through these and just talk about the rules. From the crack of the bat, the runner was in motion. It should read from the crack of the bat, comma, the runner was in motion. Introductory phrases of 4 or more words always get a comma. This is an introductory phrase from the crack of the bat. It's a prepositional phrase, adverb phrase. So we would set that off with a comma after bat. He pitched 2 games this season, both against tough competition. Okay. We are setting off the non-essential information both against tough competition with a comma. So after season, there's a comma. Set off non-essential or interrupters with commas. Coming into this game, he is in a serious slump. Coming into this game, again, when you begin the sentence, the participial phrase, you want to set it off with a comma. Coming into this game describes he, the subject of the sentence. So, comma after game. He was born in Allegheny, Pennsylvania in 1949. This is what we call a standard use. You would separate a city from a state with a comma. So, Allegheny, Pennsylvania, put a comma after Allegheny. He promised to ask his father, who works for Random House. We're going to put a comma after father. Who works for Random House is an adjective clause. And adjective clauses receive commas when they are non-essential. In this case, we don't need to know that he works for Random House. So we would put a comma after father. From the very beginning of the story, you know that he is dead. This is just like the first one. This is an introductory phrase of 4 or more words. From the very beginning of the story is an adverb phrase. So set that off with a comma and then begin the sentence of the subject you, or begin the main clause of the subject you after that comma. He asked for a spade, a special kind of garden tool. We're going to put a comma after spade. A special kind of garden tool is an appositive phrase telling you more about spade. We set it off with a comma there. Oh, I wanted to talk to you about something. Set off the interjection oh with a comma. When interjections show really strong emotion, we would use an exclamation point, but this is kind of mild, so oh, comma, I wanted to talk to you about something. Watching from the stands, you could tell he was throwing hard. Watching from the stands is a participial phrase describing you. So watching from the stands, comma, you could tell he was throwing hard. And then before you jump to conclusions, listen to her explanation. This is an adverb clause beginning the sentence, and as such it would receive a comma. Before you jump to conclusions, comma, and then we have the command, listen to her explanation. Lastly, we are going to deal very quickly with commas and semicolons, comparing the use of commas and semicolons. So what would we use in these examples? What would you use between the different changes of type? He has visited Germantown, Pennsylvania, Omaha, Nebraska, and Newark, New Jersey. All right. This is that very, very peculiar use of the semicolon. Normally in a list, you separate items with commas. If the items in your list have commas in them already, you use semicolons. So, he only visited 3 places. He visited Germantown, Pennsylvania, he visited Omaha, Nebraska, and he visited Newark, New Jersey. Because you have commas between the cities and states, we would use semicolons to separate these. We would say Germantown, Pennsylvania, semicolon, Omaha, Nebraska, semicolon, and Newark, New Jersey. So that's how it's done. He walked for hours. Nothing could stop him from continuing. Now, these are 2 independent clauses that are being separated in some way. I don't have a conjunction, so here I need a semicolon. All right. If I had what are called coordinating conjunctions, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so, you remember those as fanboys? If I had one of those, I could use a comma, but I don't. So I need a semicolon here to join. He walked for hours to nothing could stop him from continuing. She brought the following items to class: a notebook, a pencil, and a protractor. Those are going to be separated by commas because it's just a standard list. Nothing really fancy there. A notebook, comma, a pencil, comma, and a protractor. She didn't listen to instructions, so she made many mistakes. Now, here again, I have 2 independent clauses. She didn't listen to instructions. She made many mistakes. I'm joining them together. But in this case, I have the conjunction so. So in this one, I'm going to use a comma. She didn't listen to instructions, comma, so she made many mistakes. So is important there. That conjunction means I can use a comma. Most of my friends lost their money, their wallets, and their credit cards. Again, typical list. I'm going to use commas. Their money, comma, their wallets, comma, and their credit cards. So that is the grammar section of this. I'm actually going to go, if you see on the rest of the review sheet, there are literary works listed, but I'm going to go to a slightly different format. And again, those of you in my classes will recognize this, just to talk over the literary works in the different periods. So let's do that. All right. So this will be our literature review. And like I said, I'm going to take this period by period, and then we'll talk about major works, and then I'll give some summative ideas about essays. The first major period would be the Puritan period. We're talking here about 1620 to the early to mid 1700s. We're talking here about like roughly the first 100 or so years of English colonization in the New World. You can see that I have some works listed up here. I've written in the names of the authors, as well as written in some guide words here, and I'm just going to use these as sort of my talking points. So this document is also available on my website, mrfranksclass.com. You can navigate to English 10, you can see this. So if you want to have sort of on your screen at some point in time the words I'm looking at, you can do that. Like I said, I'm using this more as kind of a note sheet so that I know the points to hit. And those of you that have me for class, you've seen this. So here you go. Of Plymouth Plantation was written by William Bradford. To My Dear and Loving Husband and Upon the Burning of Our House are both written by Anne Bradstreet. Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God is written by Jonathan Edwards. I put an asterisk next to that because it is written a lot later than those other ones, and you could sort of construe Edwards as being a member of the colonial period in a weird way. But because he's a Puritan minister and because his work is so obviously religious, he fits in very well here. So if you wanted to write about Edwards as being part of Revolutionary America or Colonial America, you could probably do so. But you also could seat him securely in the Puritan period too. So there you go. All right, what do we talk about with this period? The major focus and the major emphasis is on religion. These people came to the New World for religious freedom. Their rhetoric is so heavily steeped in religion that it's almost impossible to separate anything that they're doing from their religious beliefs. The word separatist is there. They viewed themselves as separatists, as in separate from Church of England. The Church of England was sort of an oppressive mechanism in England, and these folks felt like they were second-class citizens, and they did not have the same rights and privileges as Anglicans, so they sought to come to the New World. They first went to the Netherlands, if you just want to remember historically, and then the New World, settling in Plymouth. Allusion was an important technique. There's lots of allusions to the Old Testament in particular. By allusion, we mean a direct or an indirect reference to another literary work. In this case, alluding to Scripture, making references to the Psalms or to Job or to some of the images from Genesis or Exodus. So lots of allusion. Puritan plain. The writing style is very stripped down, very bare, very easy to understand. The fact that this writing is 400 years old in some cases, and that we are still reading this English cleanly and with relative ease, is a testament to how simple it was. I always say this: William Bradford's life overlaps with William Shakespeare's life, but how much differently does Bradford write than Shakespeare? It's a much plainer style. A core belief of the Puritans was predestination, so that's written there. Predestination meant that before birth, before conception, God has in mind who is saved and who is not, who is saved and who is damned. Those that are saved are called the elect. And what this belief really kind of renders is that there really is no such thing as free will. We sort of believe, in our Catholic faith, and I think that, kind of more modern thinking people tend to believe that our decisions matter, and the things we do matter. It seems funny to even talk about it in these terms, but that you kind of determine your moral worth and your moral integrity through your actions and through your choices. But the Puritans believe those things to be determined for you. You were good, you were intrinsically good or intrinsically bad because God made you so, not because of some act on your own. So this was all sort of in the theology of a man named John Calvin, a French-born Swiss theologian who wrote this book, Institutes of Christian Religion. Geneva was really his home for many, many years in Switzerland. And so Calvinism is the word used to, kind of define his philosophy and his adherents. Puritanism is an offshoot of Calvinism, right? And one of the major beliefs of Calvinism that we keep coming back to, or of Puritanism we keep coming back to, is this idea of total depravity. This is a very doom and gloom philosophy, a very doom and gloom religion, and that's seen best in Edwards. Man is sinful. We are all imperfect, and given enough time, we will all fall from grace. Very pessimistic view, and very much a guilt-ridden, I guess you could say, paranoid style. If you think about sinners in the hands of an angry God, he spends a lot of time telling everyone how awful they are. And that is not very palatable to a modern audience, but that was the mindset, that was the optique of the Puritans. Moving on then into the colonial period, so now we're talking about the mid-1700s through 1770s into the 1780s when we have the Revolution. So the works I have here: The Speech of the Second Virginia Convention by Patrick Henry, The Crisis #1 by Thomas Paine, The Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson. I put an asterisk there because the Declaration of Independence is technically the work of the Committee of Five, but we think of Jefferson as the lead writer on that, and he receives most of the credit. And then To His Excellency General Washington, which was a poem written by Phyllis Wheatley, the slave who became free. Very interesting story on that. So, obviously, we're talking about the colonial period leading into Revolutionary War. Politics is on everyone's mind. So, political rhetoric, what was religious rhetoric by the Puritans, is being replaced kind of by political rhetoric. There's a lot of discussion of freedom and right to freedom, and can we in any sort of way justify the tyranny of the British, or if we can't, what do we do to address it? So that political rhetoric does have religious undertones to it, and that's not accidental at all. I think that a lot of the same motives that led people to come to the New World for religious freedom are going to lead them to want political freedom as well. The Committee of Five, and you can see I've written it in there, I zoomed in and wrote it small. Let me zoom in again. All right. Committee of Five was Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Those are the 5 men responsible for writing the direct declaration. But really, like I said before, most of the credit goes to Jefferson, and that's okay. This was all influenced by Enlightenment philosophy. When you think of the Enlightenment, key figures would be people like Isaac Newton and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Understanding the world through science, questioning the institutions that had been in power since the Dark Ages, questioning the monarchy, questioning the church, basically saying that things need to be proven through reason, and that man's intellect was the greatest tool to understanding the universe, not some kind of prescribed philosophy that you didn't yourself determine, but your own analytical mind could lead you to insights. And then the Enlightenment philosopher that is most directly influential in early American politics would be John Locke, because John Locke wrote several works that Jefferson really directly quoted or paraphrased in the Declaration of Independence, and it's from Locke that Jefferson gets this concept of inalienable rights. Locke originally had them as life, liberty, and property being one of the tenets of philosophical liberalism that kind of underscores the whole Enlightenment and democratic movement. But property was problematic in the colonies, so life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, those things that are just kind of ring in the ear of every American, those come from John Locke, who had written them in England about 100 years before. So that's just a quick run through the colonial period. Notice how Speech to the Second Virginia Convention, Crisis, and Declaration of Independence are non-fiction political works. To His Excellency General Washington, that's sort of the outlier. It's a poem. It's written in a very grand, flowery, Grecian, like ancient Greek kind of style. There's allusions to Muse and Aeolus, these Greek gods, but it's making Washington into this mythic sort of hero on a Greek scale. So it's an interesting piece, but definitely very different from the political pieces that are being discussed otherwise. Then we have our literature of the early Republic. We're talking here about the very late 1700s and the early 1800s. There are 2 short stories we read: The Devil and Tom Walker by Washington Irving, and The Pit and the Pendulum by Edgar Allan Poe. All right, we're talking here about the rise of a national identity distinct from the UK, distinct from England. We are trying to define ourselves now as a new and separate entity, and to do that we need to kind of get away from our British forebears in some way. And The Devil and Tom Walker is an interesting step in that direction, because The Devil and Tom Walker, with its idea of selling your soul to the devil, and of this kind of idea of the devil as a real physical being that you have to confront, obviously has its roots in the Old Testament, in the second story of creation, but also has its roots in the German folktale that became a drama in the Romantic period, Faust, which was written by Goethe. So it's interesting because, again, I would point that out because here you have a non-English antecedent to something. You have the borrowing of a German writer's work. So again, we're not exclusively kind of an intellectual byproduct of England. So that's sort of interesting. And this is the time that we see the rise of Romanticism. Poe is one of the great figures in the Romantic movement, and Romanticism is really a century-long movement from 1800 to 1900, roughly, in music, art, architecture, philosophy, and also certainly in literature. So that sort of coincides the early days of the American experiment. And again, that's not a coincidence. You have these democratic revolutions preceding Romanticism. You have this, generation that has rewritten the rules on who has power in the world, and naturally that means you're going to rewrite the rules of art as well. So, rise of Romanticism at this time. These 2 short stories are very kind of interesting in side-by-side comparison. They both kind of have slightly unusual narrators. The Pit and the Pendulum employs a first-person narrator telling you about surviving this incredibly strange ordeal. And then The Devil and Tom Walker has a third-person narrator who is very much aware that he's telling a story. And there's this sort of unreliability to it, and there's this sort of acknowledging different versions of the story in there. So there's a lot of fun going on in these works. So then we started the second trimester studying Transcendentalism. This is a period called the American Renaissance. As you can see, that's my first little talking point. A big moment of national identity and a big moment of American creativity. We have three works we're going to talk about here. Self-Reliance by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and then Walden and Civil Disobedience, both by Henry David Thoreau. So like I said, the American Renaissance, Transcendentalism is a uniquely American philosophy. This all grows out of the Industrial Revolution and a reaction to industrialism and to technology. But while the rest of the world processes industrialization at different times and in different ways, no one processed it quite the way we did with Emerson and Thoreau. In fact, another world philosophy grows up at this exact same time, Marxism. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels write the Communist Manifesto, in similar circumstances to Emerson and Thoreau writing their works, but their conclusions are very different. So it's kind of an interesting moment of definition for us. If I were to define Transcendentalism, I would give it these four parts. I would say that Transcendentalism emphasized the primacy of nature, the importance of nature as the supreme teacher, the role of the individual, the ability that one person has to shape and redefine the world that he lives in, the struggle between man and machine. This is probably the first time in a modern sense that technology becomes so powerful that people are questioning whether or not we should advance in this way. And then finally, the interconnectedness of all things. This is a concept that Emerson called the oversoul, something he kind of borrowed out of Indian scriptural writings. But this idea that all of creation is united, and it's united in nature. So we keep coming back to that idea of nature as the supreme teacher, right? That God is most manifest and most knowable in nature. Then, shortly after Transcendentalism, we get into the 1860s, which is obviously marked by the American Civil War. We read Robert E. Lee's Letters to His Son. We read two poems by Walt Whitman that'll appear in the test, I Hear America Singing and Beat Drums. We read the short story An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge by Ambrose Bierce, and we read the Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln. All right. So we say here, first of all, influence of Transcendentalism. The Transcendentalists push forward a lot of social causes, conservationism, women's rights, but also abolitionism. Think about that. If philosophically one of the things you say is that every individual has a right to his or her own mind, and that you can be a nonconformist, and that you can challenge authority, and that everyone's mind is an integral part of the world, you can't really have slavery, can you? It sort of stands to reason that this philosophy would oppose ownership of humans. So you have this movement of Transcendentalism, and then a decade later you have the cataclysm of the Civil War. Not accidental. Now, one of the things that's interesting about the Civil War is that there are a wide spectrum of attitudes. There's a wide spectrum of attitudes toward the conflict. And I've made a very crude kind of breakdown of this here, but there are two writers that when you read them about the Civil War really celebrate this war as this necessary sweeping change, and that there's a heroism to this war, right? When Walt Whitman writes in Beat Drums, or when he writes in Captain My Captain, or he writes in When Lilacs Last, the Dooryard Bloomed, Whitman is celebrating the heroes of the war. He's talking about the nobility of people like Lincoln in preserving the Union through fighting. When Lincoln is talking in the Gettysburg Address, he definitely is stressing how important this conflict is and how necessary it is. These men both believed morally in the necessity of eliminating the institution of slavery. And they sort of are willing to make the sacrifice in life and in blood that the war was. On the other side of this, you have Ambrose Bierce and Robert E. Lee, and in my class we read a poem called Shiloh by Herman Melville, where there's a much more nuanced and sort of complicated understanding of the war, where maybe this war was a tragic mistake. Bierce kind of shows this ambiguity in the way he structures the story. Peyton Farquhar, the protagonist in Occurrence Without Greek Bridge, is a well-meaning guy who gets duped and tricked and is going to be killed. And you really can kind of question the justice of what's happening to him. And it shows that, in a war that's brother versus brother, in a war where no matter who wins the battle, someone is losing the war. This idea that you never win a civil war. Ultimately your country loses in this fight. That's a very kind of, I guess you could say, a more modern or a very convoluted take on it. And Robert E. Lee expresses that in a letter to his son as well, that he doesn't want to fight, that there's something inherently wrong in turning arms against your country, but yet he ultimately does. So it's a very complicated, hard to kind of pin down attitude. And so that is something that's interesting about the Civil War, is that there are people that can feel very different ways about it. Not so unlike, the way the Vietnam War was a polarizing event in 20th century America. There are those that served and questioned whether or not they should be there. There are people who lost their lives and were kind of spat upon for doing so. The Civil War kind of inspired that division as well, and was a very contentious and divisive topic. Then finally, the last of the periods of short works, we'll call it here modern American poetry. We read some other modern work, but we're going to focus on poetry for everything in the late 19th century into the 20th. We have here Richard Cory by Edwin Arlington Robinson. We have 2 poems by Emily Dickinson, If You Were Coming in the Fall and Because I Could Not Stop for Death. We have 2 poems by Robert Frost, Mending Wall and Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. And then we have a poem by Langston Hughes called The Negro Speaks of Rivers, which was part of the Harlem Renaissance. If I were to make some summary comments about modern American poetry, we can note it by the rise of free verse, that Whitman is really the trailblazer in this regard. That Whitman comes along at a time when poetry is very formal and very formalized, and you followed convention and rule. And Whitman breaks that wide open with his sort of conversational long lines and his very colloquial voice and his focus on everyday subjects. So now you get to a poetry that we kind of recognize as being very modern and sounding and feeling like modern English. Not poetry that sounds like replicas of English ballads or of Greek models, but that is very fresh and speaks to kind of a middle class America. Now, the exception of this free verse thing is Frost. Frost wrote very tightly metered verse. Mending Wall is an example of blank verse, lines of unrhymed iambic pentameter, and Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening is a very tightly measured iambic tetrameter with a very set rhyme scheme. So even within this movement of free verse, there are exceptions to the rule. And then these are all lyric poems. Now, lyric is kind of defining as different from narrative poems. And if you think back to the Greek tradition, you had these 2 things in ancient Greece. You had the narrative poems of Homer, and you had the verse dramas of Aeschylus and Sophocles, and then you had lyric poetry by people like Pindar, who wrote shorter works that focused on maybe a hero, in the odes, or some kind of object. And that's really, if you want to think about the object, that's what these are. These are analysis by image, I say here. If you think about Mending Wall, Mending Wall gives you this perfect idea of exploring an idea or exploring a concept through an image. Mending Wall, the wall is the metaphor. Do we need this wall between us? Do we need something to provide protection? Do we need a barrier? Or can we live in a world where we knock those things down and we accept one another? And again, the conclusion is kind of fun and sort of complicated and humorous, but that image of the wall is central to the poem. And the Negro Speaks of Rivers, the rivers are the objects we're contemplating, but really it's much more than that. It's the entire history of a race. So in lyric poetry, we want to talk about analysis by image. We'll move on talking about the major works. The first of our major works is Ethan Frome. So Ethan Frome, obviously, it's hard to sum up an entire novel in just a couple minutes, but if I were talking about big things from Ethan Frome, first of all, it's a frame story. By that we mean it begins in what we could call the fictional present. It flashes back, Most of the story is told in flashback, and then in the end we come back to that fictional present. So we end where we began, and in between we go someplace else. There's a lot of great symbols in this book, and right off the bat in the beginning, we're given two, or you could say a couple. The missing L on Ethan Frome's farm is sort of symbolic of the degradation and the damage he suffered, as well as his limp and his scar. The limp says that it's like a chain jerking him back at every step, and the scar across his forehead. This is a man who has been damaged, and our narrator wants to know why and how, and that's the inspiration. That's the impetus for the whole book. Okay, again, this is something for those of you that have me for class. This is one of my little, catchphrases and one of my little pet topics. But el amor prohibido. I use this just because it's memorable and it's a little joke, but it really does tie it together. All of our major works this year have this as some kind of central theme. By the way, if you don't have me for class, and you write el amor prohibido on your test, your teacher will not know what you're talking about. This is not something that is widely regarded in the community. This is a Mr. Frank thing, and to my students, I apologize for making you sound weird if you ever said this somewhere. Sorry about that. But anyways, my point is that it's meaning literally the forbidden love. The thing that you want is what leads to your destruction. And that is true in this book. It's true in The Great Gatsby. And it's true in The Glass Menagerie. The thing that Ethan wants, in other words, Maddie, his wife's cousin, is the thing that leads to his destruction. So the pursuit of that is really what brings the trauma. Another very symbolic thing in this book, color, right? Maddie is usually shown with the color red. When we first meet her, she's wearing a red scarf. The red of her lips is discussed. The red pickle dish at dinner. And then that's kind of juxtaposed with these very neutral, very gray, lifeless colors that Xena is described in. So whereas Maddie is red and full of life and vitality, Xena is always whites and blacks and grays. It's always very kind of lifeless, prematurely aged, things like that. Again, more symbolism, the pickle dish and the cat. The red glass pickle dish that breaks at dinner. It breaks when Ethan and Maddie's hands touch ever so briefly. It really is sort of showing this should not be. It goes back to that el amor prohibido thing. This is bad. This is taboo. We should not be doing this. Right? The cat in that scene also is sort of this reminder of Xena. The cat sits in Xena's chair. When the cat moves from Xena's chair, the chair rocks as though Xena were in it. The cat is the actual the cat breaks the pickle dish. It seems as though when Ethan sees that cat, he is seeing his wife, and again, there's this guilt to that. And then I've highlighted here the word naturalism. Naturalism is this philosophy, and this was a very big literary movement in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Is this philosophy that your environment is deterministic, that we are all victims of factors beyond our control, that you cannot rise up out of your circumstances, that you are really going to be determined by your socioeconomics and the matter of fact surroundings of your life, that despite your talent, despite your drive and ambition, you're sort of fated to be somewhere. And that's Ethan. Ethan is a smart guy. Ethan is a driven guy. He's a talented guy. He cannot get out of Starkfield. No matter what he does, it just keeps pulling him back. Every time there's a glimmer of hope for him, something bad happens. That's not his fault. That keeps him there. And so that is a very pessimistic worldview, but it is nonetheless the worldview of the book. Now, Great Gatsby, again, we have this theme of the forbidden love. Gatsby's pursuit of Daisy, his all-encompassing, all-consuming pursuit of Daisy, is what leads to his destruction. It's what leads to his deceit, to this creation of wealth, to this fantastic kind of lifestyle that he can't sustain, and it's pursuing Daisy that gets him killed. And then this is the, to me, the greatness of this book is the the wonderful examination of this struggle between real self and ideal self. Right, and I have here Platonic conception. That's a direct quote. Nick says that J. Gatsby of West Egg, Long Island, sprang from his Platonic conception of himself. And this kind of calls to mind Plato's allegory of the cave, and to make this very quick, what I would say is this, is that when we say Platonic, whenever you say something is Platonic, like a Platonic relationship or a Platonic ideal, it is not real. It is something that exists in the mind, not that exists in reality. And that's the problem, is that everyone has these ideas of themselves that are not real. Every character in this book struggles with this idea. Every single one. The most obvious is Gatsby, and the one that we most readily latch onto is Gatsby, but each and every character has some kind of problem with who they actually are versus who they think they are or who they want to be. Right? We see this in Nick, we see this in Daisy, we see this in Tom, we see this in Jordan. We most of all see it in Gatsby. For many people, this novel is really about the death of the American dream. The American dream being this idea that you can start with nothing, through your own efforts, your own talent, your own hard work, you can achieve great success. And Jay Gatsby proves that that is true and that is false. It's true because he does it. Jay Gatsby is born, James Gatz with nothing, and Jay Gatsby is a millionaire, but it proves how empty that ultimately is and how it's built upon flimsy foundations. So for many people, this book was an indictment of the American dream and how we are too capitalistic and too focused on material success. And so that's kind of a social commentary along with the book. Again, getting back a little to the ideal versus real self thing, one of the great aspects of this novel is the subtle but always present comparison of Nick and Gatsby. Nick and Gatsby get put together in so many interesting ways. They're not just next door neighbors. They don't just have these kind of brushes with each other. Their first meeting is over some kind of presumed connection of World War I, whether that's real or not. In the opening of the book, Nick says that he descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch, or however you say it, which is a place name in Scotland. And then Gatsby says that he took a picture at Oxford with the Earl of Doncaster. Those are the same guy. So was Gatsby actually posed in a photo with Nick's long-lost cousin? They're all subtle, and taken in isolation, they might not mean anything, but added up, Fitzgerald is really trying to put Gatsby and Nick together and show you that these two men are unbelievably similar. Nick has that moment where he says he's within and without. He's both an active participant in what's going on and an observer. And that's Gatsby. Gatsby is within and without too. Gatsby belongs in this world, but also doesn't belong in this world. And that was Fitzgerald. He always felt himself an outsider, even when he was, at his most successful. And then, of course, Old Money versus New Money, East Egg versus West Egg. This sort of tension, and again, this social criticism and class consciousness of this book, that even when you are wealthy, there are people who can look down upon you, and that even great wealth is not the ultimate measure of success. One of these things that makes this book such a lasting document of 20th century American life. Lastly, we have The Glass Menagerie. So talking about The Glass Menagerie, a couple things to emphasize. Number one, the setting of this in the 1930s is crucial. This book is very much steeped in a particular time period. Tom tells this from a later date. This play was written at the end of World War II, when everyone was keenly aware of what we had just been through. But the idea of this play taking place at an incredibly hard time, where every character is feeling tremendous economic pressure, the idea that the world is on the brink of ultimate disaster, that informs these events so much. So you have to take account of the fact that this play is set in the 30s. It is a memory play, meaning that it's all tinged with our understanding of things as they are now. Looking back on it, these events might not seem that significant, but being where we are now, they are significant. And that Tom breaks the fourth wall here. Tom directly addresses the audience, which is not the most unusual thing, but it is a little different because Tom is both a participant in the action and a commentator on the action, so that's important. One of the themes of this play is escape and escapism. Every single character in the play has his or her means of escape. Amanda is a classic escapist. She lives in her own past. She keeps talking about Blue Mountain. Tom escapes through drinking, through going to the movies, through his own writing. Jim escapes in the thoughts of his own future, in the dreams of success that he'll one day have. Laura escapes to the Glass Menagerie and to the old phonograph records. Now again, El Amor Prohibido, let's tie this neatly in a bow with the other works. First of all, there's the relationship that can't be, and again, there's a striking parallel here to Frome. Just as Ethan Frome and Maddie, when they're alone and their hands touch, the pickle dish breaks. As Jim and Laura are dancing together, the unicorn breaks. And it really is this kind of very clear-cut symbol of this cannot be, this should not be, this is wrong. But then also, pursuing the thing that you most want leads to destruction. Tom leaves his family, and this whole play is an expression of his guilt over that. Tom's final monologue tells us that he left, but he cannot really truly leave behind his sister, and he feels terrible guilt over it. And you realize that, though Tom might be better off having left his family, he is always finding himself looking backward, wondering what could have been. So those are our major works, and hopefully that gives you some ideas. So to conclude here, just a couple of thoughts on essays. I'll try to be as, sweeping and general as I can be so that we encompass all possibilities. Obviously, when we're talking about literary essays, there's going to be a compare and contrast thing. I would say that you can group your works two ways. You can group them by period, you can group them by style. By which I mean, try to find common ideas across time periods, which is what I've been talking about when I was talking earlier in this presentation, but also across styles, like how did American poetry evolve? If you look at Phyllis Wheatley or Anne Bradstreet as an early American poet, then you compare those women's work to E.A. Robinson or Edgar Lee Masters or Robert Frost. What does that say about where poetry's gone? If I looked at the Puritan period, how did that influence the Revolution? If I looked at the Civil War period, what does that mean for modernism? So looking at things by time period, but also looking at things by style. I would look for themes across multiple works. There's a lot about religion in our American literature. There's a lot about nature, not just for the Transcendentalists, but nature as a force across. And there's a lot of war. We have read works written around the Revolution, around the Civil War. We have read works that mention or make mention of World War I, World War II. We read, at least in my class, we read Ambush by Tim O'Brien, dealing with the Vietnam War. There's a lot of violence, and that finds its way into the literature, and you can talk about that. And then I would find a way of connecting major works. Now, I was doing that before, talking about this El Amor Prohibido nonsense, but basically, if you think about, in what way can you say these writers are working on similar projects? In what way are they saying similar things about human nature? Those would always be good for essays. So I hope you found this helpful. And best of luck to you in your preparation for this exam and all others.